So everybody, this is it. I just got into tearing into this and figured I'd go ahead and start taping. So here it is. Here is the front driver's side of my car. And right inside here, we've got, if you cannot see it, a bent control arm. I know you really can't see that too well, but you can see it. So how awesome is that? I just got it out of the car, the subframe, and just kind of inspecting it for any kind of flaws or imperfection, just as the books say. I don't see anything major, anything goofy wrong with it, but then again, I am not by any means a subframe expert. The fruits of my labor. So we have right down here our sway arm. Here's our tie rod, which I had to disconnect. This is probably an ABS sensor here. And then, of course, our axle. Now, I had to get a special 32 millimeter axle nut from O'Reilly's. Pick your place an impact socket though, because this was pretty hard to spin. And I used an old electric wrench that my father gave me. Thank you, Dad. And that made my job much easier. So I was able to undo that. But I'm going to rewind and tell you the sequence of events because that is important. So first, when you take off the control arm, let me grab my control arm here. So, removal and assembly is very important in getting the control arm off and getting everything else off. So, I'm going to show you on the replacement control arm that I have what sequence I did. So, I started out first by disconnecting the sway bar, which was right here. So, as I mentioned before, it's that swinging down part. Then next, I loosen, actually like on this guy here, it's a screw with a nut on the right side. I undid the screw, and I didn't undo anything else out past there. Next, I took these two screws out of the back end. This is the main control arm bushing that you'll see on a lot of replacement forums. They have urethane bushings and some other higher performance setups, more rigid in nature. After that, I went back and, to my recollection, before I did this, let me make a comment that I did spray paint all around the area so that I could see how the bracket was lined up. If you notice, there are slots in here for adjustment later on, toe in, toe out adjustment. So very, very minor, but it is important that at the very least it gets lined up where it was, prior to all the removal. At that point, I went back to this and removed the screw. And basically I had to wiggle this down, but everything came off really easily. With exception of course, the ball joint. So I couldn't undo the bolt, and I couldn't undo it from the assembly. So that's of course what led me to this point. So let me just take a moment and describe to you what I did in order to get that out. First things first, with all the steering stuff, alignment is very, very important. So as you can see on here, I spray painted it with orange spray paint first, and then I went back and tried to hit it up with some whiteout to give it a little bit more definitive line between the connecting piece and this. So I lined those up first. Then I was able to take the top screws nut off and the bottom. Now I'm going to stop here and say that I don't know that you can see that real well here from this photo, but the bottom hole is just a hole. The top hole is slightly oblong. So that's where you adjust camber. Once again, I think I spray painted around it to have some sense of where I left off in terms of alignment. That way, when I go to drive this later for a test run, I want to make sure that it's, decent. So I did that with both sides. I actually had to heat up on the bottom nut I had to heat up with the MAP gas in order to get it off. With the electric impact wrench, combine those two, and the top hole is slightly oblong. So that's where you adjust camber. Once again, I think I spray painted around it to have some sense of where I left off in terms of alignment. That way, when I go to drive this later for a test run, I want to make sure that it's, decent. So I did that with both sides. I actually had to heat up on the bottom nut. I had to heat up with the MAP gas in order to get it off. With the electric impact wrench, combine those two, and I got both off there. I kept the screws in for the time being because I wasn't sure how loaded it was going to be if it was. So then I went down to the tie rod, and there's a cotter pin in there, so you have to punch that out and then loosen that nut. So I did that. Next I took out the ABS sensor. That was a neat little trick. And then of course I took off the axle nut. That's the 32 millimeter impact socket that I had. That came out like a champ with the electric impact wrench. Right after that, I poked out one of the two screws, and then I poked out the second one. It wasn't really loaded. You can tell because the assembly had some give to it, and you can tell that it was not loaded. So the other things I did not mention, I just remembered, are the brake rotor and calipers. So I took that out of the way and tied it up with some wire that I have laying around, so it's up and out of the way. So everything's apart. What I did next is I had to get that ball joint out of there. This was fun. If you can't sense my sarcasm, I'm sorry you didn't catch it. This was really a treat. So this earlier today was stuck in there. Fortunately, I have access to some very, very smart and willing people. So they were able to drill out what I attempted to get with an easy out and a torch on this side, the clearance, and then on the other side it's tapped. The machinist that I dealt with thought after he tapped it with an M10 by 1.5, and he thought after the fact it actually should get an M10 by 1.25. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a screw through there, and then on the back end put a jam nut with a lock washer. So a few little tips and tricks there, or a few things. Hello everybody, I figured I'd share with you some of my experiences as I go along here. I'm a big fan of putting anti-seize on almost everything. I'm preparing this casting for the entry of the ball joint. The reason I'm preparing it is because it won't fit in now. So I'm going to take my handy dandy Dremel tool and just kind of touch up the areas and prep them so this hopefully slips right in. The pitch of the threads was M10 by 1.25. So when he did to M10 by 1.5, I just happened to have the same size and pitch thread. Then I can use this, and I'm not quite sure that those threads are going to be real sturdy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this through, tighten it down all the way that I can, and then put a nut on the back side here with a lock washer. Now the factory setup used a lock washer as well as a lock washer on the head end, and that was the only place because there wasn't a nut. It just used this side for threads. But since I'm not quite sure, I'm going to err on the side of safety, especially since this is kind of an important place on the suspension. One keynote, I did check on the opposite side of the vehicle just to make sure I turned the wheel all the way the opposite direction just to verify. Everything looked okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and move forward with getting the ball joint in there, getting it all lubed up with anti-seize. The same thing with this screw, the lock washer and nut, and I'm going to go ahead and do the assembly. I'll explain it to you later. The axle and the strut connected, and some of the things that I did was I re-greased the inside of where the bearing is in this hub, and then right after I did that, I just put a light coat of grease on the mating surfaces. So I didn't get too much because the anti-lock brake sensor goes in there, so I didn't want it to be all goopy with grease, but I wanted there to be enough to where it replenishes what's there. are what needs to be there. So in order to get this up there, first I had to install the axle in here, and then I was able to push this up and locate it to one of the holes, the top hole. And I'm going to stop once again. If you remember what I was saying earlier, the top here actually is it's got the camber adjustment. So you'll see it, it'll be cammed or it'll be lobed. So this is where the adjustment will be made to create camber, negative or positive for your tire. The one below, which I'm about to insert, I'm going to just show you exactly what I did with the other one. Now there's a slight difference here. The top one was a screw, and then it has a lock washer or a washer of some kind on the end, and then the nut. This one did not. So what I did is I went ahead and got the nut on the bottom of the ball joints there, and then I started the screw. Just started on one end, and at that point I went ahead and there are these two connecting points. The one's a little farther up and about, but you should see what I mean on your vehicle. So these were hard. I had to use a screwdriver in one of the other holes to kind of help shift this to the left as we're looking at it. Same thing for the other side. It's not an easy feat to tackle, but I got those in, and then I came back up here to this control arm connection to the body, and I just kind of wiggled and jiggled some things and finally got it across to where I can get the nut on there, and voila. And once again, making sure that I'm putting anti-seize or grease on it just to make sure that, once again, I rod on here for next person. I don't have an extra cotter pin, so I can't put it in just yet. Got to make a run to the hardware store tomorrow for that. I did, however, get the sway bar all done. Now, a little trick that I found that worked, because as you'll see, this is not straight, it's offset. I think once the car is loaded with its own weight, it will straighten out. What I had to do was loosen up this top screw assembly until the bottom would fit in there. So once I was able to do that, I was able to get the screw and the nut on there, and everything was fine. Then I had to go back and tighten up the top. So that wasn't too bad. Another thing that I did that took quite some time is the, let me point to it up here, right here, our subframe. So I've got, if you remember, we were supposed to have 6 per side. You fit it into this end first. There's a slot, so you can fit it up there. Then you can tighten down the 2 front bolts, which take a 12 millimeter, or at least get them started, and then you do the rest of them going back. And then what I did is I snugged up the front. I didn't make them really tight, and then I snugged up all the others, and then I just did one final pass after that. I made sure that there was anti-seize on all of them, and just tightened them down nice and snug. I didn't really crank on them, but I wouldn't say that I was really wimpy on them either. So the third pass, I started up front and went backwards. Started on one side, went to the other, hopped down to bolt 5, come to this side, bolt 5, go to bolt 4, other side bolt 4, and on and on. So everybody, I put back the car together. Everything seems to be functioning properly. So after I got the back of the brake on, I put on the rotor, then I put on the pads, the calipers, on and on and on. If you've done a brake change on the WRX, it's really not that big of a deal. So I just did that, slapped the wheel on, just double checked all my fasteners, added the plastic part that I spoke of that I needed the 3 fasteners for. So I replaced everything, put it back together. Just got done with my test drive around the neighborhood. Obviously didn't go crazy with it. Everything seemed pretty sturdy.